The first light of dawn crept across the sleepy town, washing Main Street in a soft golden glow. The old neon sign above Carla's diner buzzed faintly, flickering as if it too was waking up. Inside, the smell of sizzling bacon, fresh coffee, and warm biscuits filled the air. The diner was small, just 6 booths by the windows, a long counter with stools, and a row of faded photographs on the wall. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers rarely stayed strangers for long. At the far corner booth sat Earl Jennings, his back straight, his eyes calm, his hand steady as he lifted his chipped white mug. At 81 years old, Earl carried the quiet strength of a man who had lived through battles most men only read about. He wore a simple plaid shirt tucked into pressed trousers, his silver hair combed neatly, and his boots polished to a soft shine. A folded cap rested beside his plate, the insignia on it faded but unmistakable, U.S. Army, 101st Airborne Division. Earl wasn't just another old man in town. He was a veteran, a father, and a man whose name carried weight. People respected him not because he demanded it, but because he embodied it. Carla, the owner of the diner, moved between tables with her coffee pot in hand, stopping every few minutes to top off someone's cup. When she reached Earl, she smiled. "Morning, Earl." "Same as always?" He nodded once. "Thank you, Carla." His voice was deep, steady, carrying the kind of authority that lingered even in the smallest of words. A couple of local truckers sat at the counter, exchanging quiet jokes, while a young mother tried to keep her toddler entertained with a napkin doodle. The whole place hummed with the soft rhythm of a normal morning. But beneath the calm, there was a kind of reverence. Everyone knew Earl's story. He had fought in Vietnam, had led men through jungles and firefights, had carried brothers home and buried too many of them. He had seen the worst the world could offer, and yet here he sat, gentle, humble, never raising his voice, never showing anger. Phil, one of the truckers, leaned over to the man next to him and muttered, "Hard to believe that old fellow once jumped out of planes in the dead of night." The other man chuckled. "He's tougher than all of us combined, I bet. Just hides it better." Earl heard the words, but he didn't react. He never boasted, never reminded people of what he had done. For him, respect was not something you advertised. It was something you earned, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. As Earl took another slow sip of coffee, he glanced out the window. The town was waking up, a paperboy on his bike, a mechanic opening his shop across the street, the sheriff's cruiser rolling slowly down Main. Everything was ordinary. Everything was routine. And yet, there was an unspoken truth in that diner. Everyone felt safer knowing Earl was there. His presence alone was enough to settle nerves, to remind people that no matter how the world changed, men like him still existed, steady, reliable, unshaken. Carla returned with his breakfast, 2 eggs, bacon, and a biscuit. "Here you go, Earl. Fresh out of the oven." "Appreciate it," he replied, giving a polite nod. She lingered for a second, then said softly, "Don't know how you do it. Always so calm. Always so steady." Earl smiled faintly, lines deepening on his withered face. "No sense in rushing life, Carla. It'll pass quick enough." The room fell into a kind of quiet comfort. Forks clinked against plates, conversations rose and fell, and for a moment, the world felt unshakably normal. But outside, down the street, the faint roar of a motorcycle engine broke the morning calm. It grew louder, angrier, closer with every second. No one in the diner paid much attention yet. No one except Earl. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head, but his eyes, sharp, watchful, shifted ever so slightly toward the door. The day was about to change. And in 22 minutes, the whole town would remember why respect was something that could never be taken, only earned. The door to Carla's diner banged open so hard the little bell above it nearly broke off its hook. The chatter inside stopped for half a second before resuming in a quieter, more cautious tone. Every head turned to see who had entered. It was Travis Murdoch. Murdoch wasn't from town. He rolled through every few weeks on his black Harley, leather jacket covered in patches, chains hanging from his belt. He was the kind of man who fed on fear, swaggering into places where no one wanted trouble. Folks avoided eye contact, not out of respect, but out of calculation. It was easier not to provoke him. This morning, though, Murdoch looked different. He walked with extra arrogance, his boots thudding against the checkered diner floor. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Earl Jennings, the old veteran in the corner booth. Murdoch's smirk widened. "Well, well," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "If it isn't the town's favorite decoration. The old war hero." Carla stiffened behind the counter, her knuckles whitening around the coffee pot. She knew Murdoch's kind, loud, cruel, always searching for someone weaker to mock. But Earl was not weak. Still, something about the way Murdoch grinned made her uneasy. Murdoch swaggered over, each step a challenge, his heavy boots echoing like drumbeats. He stopped at Earl's table, looming over him. Earl didn't move. He simply cut a piece of bacon, raised it to his mouth, and chewed with calm precision. "You hear me, old man?" Murdoch leaned closer, sneering. "I asked you a question." Earl looked up at him, eyes steady but quiet. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he set down his fork and dabbed at his mouth with a napkin. "Morning," he said simply. The single word carried no fear, no anger, just composure. And that calmness was like gasoline to Murdoch's fire. "You think you're better than me?" Murdoch snarled, his voice rising. "All you've got is a dusty cap and a bunch of stories no one cares about anymore." Phil, the trucker at the counter, muttered under his breath, "Don't do it, son." But Murdoch was already too far gone. Without warning, his hand shot out. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Earl's head turned with the force of the blow, his glasses nearly sliding off his face. A collective gasp rose from the room. Forks froze in midair. The young mother pulled her child close. Carla's tray rattled in her shaking hands. Murdoch straightened, chest puffed out, a cruel grin spreading across his face. He had done it. He had slapped an 81-year-old man in front of the whole diner. The silence that followed was heavier than the slap itself. Everyone stared at Earl. Would he fight back? Would he break? Slowly, deliberately, Earl reached up and adjusted his glasses. His hand was steady. His face calm. He turned back to his plate, picked up his coffee mug, and took a slow sip. The silence deepened. It wasn't weakness they saw, it was control. Murdoch's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly covered it with a laugh. "That's it? That's all you got? Thought you old soldiers had fire left in you." He turned toward the room, expecting laughter, but none came. Not a single person smiled. The diner had shifted. Respect wasn't with Murdoch. It was with Earl, the man who had just absorbed humiliation and still sat unbroken. Earl finally spoke, his voice calm, almost too quiet to hear. "Respect has a way of coming back around, son." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Murdoch blinked, then burst into mocking laughter. "Respect? You think anyone respects you anymore? You're a relic. Just an old man hiding in a booth." But beneath his laughter, something was unsettled. He had expected rage. He had expected fear. He had gotten neither. And though no one could see it yet, the clock had started ticking. In exactly 22 minutes, Murdoch would learn what those words truly meant. The diner no longer sounded like a diner. The laughter was gone. The soft hum of morning conversation had died. All that remained was the faint hiss of the griddle and the slow tick of the clock on the wall. Every person in the room kept their eyes low, pretending to focus on plates, but their ears were tuned to the unfolding storm. Travis Murdoch stood tall in the center of it, grinning like a wolf that had cornered its prey. He strutted back and forth beside Earl's booth, leather jacket creaking, heavy boots thudding against the linoleum floor. Each step was deliberate, a taunt in itself. "You're quiet, old man," he mocked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "That all you got left?" Silence? Earl didn't rise. He didn't argue. He simply set down his fork and lifted his mug again. His hand was steady, his posture unchanged. He sipped his coffee as if Murdoch's slap had never happened. That composure unsettled the biker more than any fist could have. Murdoch slammed his palm down on the table, rattling Earl's plate. "Look at me when I talk to you." Slowly, Earl turned his eyes up. Calm. Steady. The kind of stare that had once faced bullets and explosions without flinching. His gaze didn't burn with anger, it weighed with patience. The silence stretched so long it was almost unbearable. Finally, Earl spoke, his voice low but clear. "Respect has a way of coming back around. You'll see." Murdoch blinked, caught off guard by the calmness of the words. Then he threw back his head and laughed, loud and mocking. "Respect? You think I'm afraid of you? You think anyone in here's gonna stand up for you?" He turned toward the diner, expecting cheers or at least nervous chuckles. But what he got instead was silence. Not a soul moved. Carla gripped her coffee pot like it was a weapon. Phil, the trucker, sat rigid on his stool, jaw tight. The young mother pressed her child's head into her shoulder, shielding him from the scene. The quiet was suffocating, and it wasn't aimed at Earl. It was aimed at Murdoch. Still, he pressed on, his pride refusing to bend. He leaned down so close to Earl their faces nearly touched. "You better watch yourself, old man. World's not yours anymore. Men like me run it now." Earl didn't blink. He didn't retreat. Instead, he set his coffee mug down with deliberate care. The clink of porcelain against the table was louder than Murdoch's threats. And then, faintly, so faintly most didn't notice at first, came the low rumble. It was distant, muffled, almost lost beneath the hum of the diner's fluorescent lights. But it grew. Slowly, steadily, like thunder rolling closer across a plain. The sound of diesel engines. Heavy ones. Carla froze mid-step, her eyes flicking to the window. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Phil caught it, his own lips curling in the ghost of a grin. They knew that sound. Murdoch didn't. He was too busy laughing at his own cruelty, pacing in front of Earl like a schoolyard bully who thought he owned the yard. But Earl knew. His eyes flicked once toward the window, then back to his plate. He picked up his fork again and calmly resumed eating. Seconds dragged like hours. The tension was unbearable, like a wire pulled tighter and tighter. Every breath in the diner seemed louder, every movement sharper. Murdoch's voice cut through it again. "What, you got friends comin'? Somebody gonna save you?" He sneered, gesturing toward the silent customers. "They won't. They're scared of me." Earl didn't look up. "Not scared," he murmured. "Just waiting." Murdoch frowned, unsettled by the cryptic reply. He slammed his fist against the table again, but this time, the act felt hollow. The silence in the diner wasn't fear anymore, it was expectation. The engines outside grew louder, closer, until even Murdoch's ears twitched at the sound. He turned slightly toward the door, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Earl cut another piece of bacon and ate it slowly, his eyes never leaving his plate. To him, there was no rush. The countdown had started, and only he knew how it would end. In exactly 22 minutes, Travis Murdoch's arrogance would be crushed under the weight of a truth he couldn't laugh away. The rumble outside grew clearer with each passing second. At first, it was faint enough to ignore, but soon it became impossible to mistake, the deep growl of engines built for power, not speed. Not one, not two, but several. Their synchronized hum rolled through Main Street like approaching thunder. Inside Carla's diner, the customers exchanged nervous glances. They all knew the sound. Diesel engines. Convoy engines. Military engines. Murdoch's laughter faltered for the first time. He glanced toward the door, then back at Earl. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Earl didn't answer. He simply dabbed his mouth with a napkin and laid it neatly beside his plate, calm as ever. His silence wasn't empty, it was deliberate, measured. Every movement of his hand, every sip of coffee, carried the weight of someone who had faced worse storms and survived. Carla's eyes darted to the window. She caught a glimpse of dust rising at the end of the street, stirred by heavy tires rolling closer. For the first time that morning, her tight grip on the coffee pot loosened. She exhaled, relief flickering across her face. She knew who was coming. Phil, still sitting at the counter, leaned forward slightly, his trucker's instincts recognizing the cadence of the engines. "That's no biker gang," he whispered to the man beside him. "That's a convoy." Murdoch's jaw tightened. His earlier swagger seemed to dim, though he quickly tried to mask it with another bark of laughter. "So what?" Trucks passed through all the time. But the others in the diner weren't convinced. They felt it in their bones, this wasn't just passing traffic. This was purposeful. Earl finally lifted his eyes from his plate, not to Murdoch, but to Carla. The faintest nod passed between them, so subtle it would have been missed by anyone not watching closely. Carla straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Murdoch noticed. "What are you smiling at, waitress?" he snapped, stepping toward her. "You think those trucks out there mean something? You think anyone's gonna step in here and—" The engines roared louder, close now, just a block away. Murdoch's words faltered against the rising sound. His eyes flicked nervously to the window, then back to Earl. The old man's calmness had shifted into something heavier, not smugness, not arrogance, but certainty. Earl reached for his coffee again. His hand didn't tremble. His eyes didn't waver. "Time's almost up," he said quietly, the words carrying just enough to be heard by the entire diner. The silence that followed was electric. The young mother in the corner hugged her child tighter, not out of fear, but anticipation. Phil's smirk returned as if he already knew how this would play out. Carla folded her arms, standing straighter, her fear evaporating like mist. Murdoch tried to laugh again, but it came out forced, cracked at the edges. He turned back toward Earl, leaning over him. "You think those engines mean anything to me? You think I'm scared of your little friends?" Earl didn't respond. He didn't need to. The engines answered for him. The low growl of the convoy grew into a full-bodied roar as the vehicle slowed just outside the diner. Headlights cut through the windows, flooding the room in sharp beams of white. Shadows stretched across the linoleum floor. The air grew thick with diesel fumes and authority. Everyone in the diner turned toward the door, waiting. Even Murdoch couldn't help but glance at it, his bravado cracking as uncertainty seeped in. Earl calmly set his cup down, folded his hands in front of him, and sat perfectly still. He had been patient, and patience always paid. Murdoch's smirk was gone now. For the first time, doubt flickered across his face. And though no one had yet stepped through that diner door, the message was already clear: Murdoch's reign of intimidation was seconds away from ending. The engines rumbled low, steady, like the growl of lions circling their prey. Earl's words lingered in the air like prophecy: respect has a way of coming back around. And now, it was here. The diner door rattled once under the pressure of the engines outside. The headlights cut across the booths like blades of white fire. Murdoch froze, his laughter choked off by something he couldn't name but felt deep in his gut. Then, the sound shifted. Doors slamming shut. Heavy boots crunching gravel. The unmistakable cadence of men trained to move as one. The bell over the diner door jingled softly, almost absurd against the thunder outside. And then he stepped in. Captain Daniel Briggs. Earl's son. He filled the doorway like a storm-given flesh, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing fatigues that still carried the dust of deployment. His jaw was set like iron, eyes sharp and unblinking, scanning the room with the precision of a man who had led soldiers through fire. Behind him, two more soldiers entered, their presence quiet but overwhelming. Outside, others remained by the trucks, silhouettes in the glare of headlights. The diner was silent except for the hum of the convoy outside. Everyone knew instinctively that this was no ordinary entrance. This was authority. This was the weight of the army pressing into a small-town diner. Murdoch's sneer faltered. He tried to regain it, puffing at his chest, but the swagger didn't land the same way. "What's this? Daddy called in the cavalry?" His voice cracked on the last word. Daniel didn't answer him. Not right away. His eyes had already locked on Earl. The old veteran still sat in his booth, calm as ever, but there was something different now, a flicker of warmth, of relief, as his son crossed the room. "Dad," Daniel said, his voice low but carrying. He walked straight to the booth, his boots echoing across the tile, and placed a steady hand on Earl's shoulder. "You okay?" Earl nodded once. "I'm fine, son." That was all it took. The exchange was simple, but it carried centuries of respect, of blood and sacrifice. Everyone in the diner felt it. Everyone but Murdoch. He barked a laugh, louder than necessary. "This is your rescue? Some army boy in uniform? You think that scares me?" Daniel finally turned to face him. His eyes locked on Murdoch's, cold and steady. "Scare you?" His voice was calm, deep, cutting. "No. But it will stop you." The biker shifted, suddenly aware of how small his gang seemed compared to the soldiers looming just outside. He spat on the floor, trying to regain ground. "You don't tell me what to do. This is between me and him," he said, pointing at Earl. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "When you laid your hand on him, you made it my business. And now, you answer for it." The words hit like a hammer. Murdoch tried to smirk, but the weight in Daniel's eyes broke through the act. For the first time, Travis Murdoch felt the edges of fear pressing against his pride. Around the diner, the customers began to breathe again. Carla leaned against the counter, her eyes glistening, watching the shift she'd prayed for. Phil's grin spread wider. Even the young mother loosened her hold on her son, whispering softly, "It's okay now." Murdoch's voice faltered as he tried one last attempt at bravado. "You think just because you've got a few soldiers outside, I'm gonna back down?" Daniel took a step closer. The room seemed to shrink around him, every inch of his frame radiating control. "Not think," he said, voice low and sharp. "No." Behind him, the other soldiers spread subtly, not aggressive, but unmistakably positioned. Their presence was a promise. Murdoch was outnumbered, outclassed, and out of time. Earl finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "You had 22 minutes, Travis. They're up." Murdoch blinked, stunned by the calm declaration. He glanced from Earl to Daniel, then to the soldiers behind him, and for the first time, his swagger collapsed. The army hadn't just arrived. Justice had walked through the door. And Travis Murdoch, the man who thought he owned the diner, the morning, and the old veteran's dignity, was about to learn just how wrong he was. The diner air was so thick with tension you could taste it. Daniel's words still hung in the room like the ring of a bell. "When you laid your hand on him, you made it my business." Murdoch's jaw clenched. Sweat beaded at his temples, though he masked it with another crooked grin. He took a deliberate step toward Earl's booth, trying to show he wasn't intimidated. "I don't care if you're army. This old man disrespected me. Nobody does that. Not in front of my crew." Daniel stepped into his path, a wall of muscle and authority. His boots planted firm on the linoleum, shoulders squared. His voice didn't rise, but its weight made everyone in the diner straighten. "Touch him again, and you won't walk out of here." Murdoch barked a laugh, sharp and forced. "Big words, soldier boy. You think a uniform gives you the right to tell me what to do?" Daniel leaned in, his eyes locked on Murdoch's like iron on iron. "No. The uniform doesn't. Respect does. Something you wouldn't understand." The biker's grin twitched into a snarl. He shoved Daniel's chest with an open palm. The contact was loud, echoing through the diner like a gunshot. Gasps broke out from the booths. Carla froze behind the counter, coffee pot trembling in her hands. The young mother clutched her child tighter. Daniel didn't move. Not an inch. The shove was nothing to him. He simply looked down at the hands still pressed against his chest, then back into Murdoch's eyes. You just made the worst mistake of your life. Murdoch swung. A wide, sloppy punch fueled more by pride than skill. Daniel moved like lightning. He caught the biker's wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and in a single fluid motion slammed Murdoch's arm down against the counter. The biker howled in pain, the sound filling the diner. Cups rattled, plates shook, and the entire room seemed to breathe again for the first time in minutes. Murdoch's crew, 2 bikers who had lingered near the door, took a step forward, hands twitching at their belts. But before they could act, 2 soldiers shifted from the doorway, stepping into position with precise, practiced movements. They didn't raise weapons, didn't shout, didn't need to. Their sheer presence froze the bikers mid-step. Daniel leaned closer to Murdoch, twisting his arm just enough to send a clear message. His voice was low, calm, lethal. You don't touch my father. Ever. Again. Murdoch's face twisted with rage and humiliation. You think you can come in here and... His words broke off into a hiss of pain as Daniel applied pressure. Respect isn't optional, Daniel continued, his tone never rising. You don't have to like him. You don't even have to apologize. But you will never disrespect him again. Or anyone else in this diner. The silence was deafening. Every customer's eyes were locked on the confrontation. Carla's lips trembled, but this time not with fear, with awe. The young mother's child whispered, "Mom, is he a hero?" and the woman hugged him tighter, nodding silently. Murdoch tried to thrash free, but Daniel's grip was unbreakable. His pride was collapsing under the weight of discipline he couldn't match. Finally, Daniel released him with a sharp shove, sending the biker stumbling back into a booth. Murdoch clutched his wrist, glaring through a mask of pain and shame. You're done here, Daniel said firmly, his voice echoing with command. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The words carried the weight of the army itself. For a long moment, Murdoch just stood there, chest heaving, rage battling with fear. Then he spat on the floor, his last act of defiance. But his eyes betrayed him. The fire was gone. The fight had been crushed. The soldiers by the door didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence made the message undeniable. If Murdoch made one more wrong move, he wouldn't just be facing Daniel, he'd be facing the full force of the U.S. Army. Earl finally spoke from his booth, his voice quiet but razor-sharp. That's the problem with bullies, Travis. They think fear is the same as respect. It isn't. The words landed like a final nail in a coffin. Murdoch's face burned red. His swagger was gone. And for the first time, everyone in the diner saw him for what he really was, not a wolf, but a coward dressed in leather. The diner smelled of spilled coffee and diesel fumes drifting in through the door, but all anyone could feel was the tension vibrating in the air. Murdoch staggered back into a booth, clutching his wrist, his breath ragged. His leather jacket, once a symbol of power, looked almost comical against Daniel's unshakable presence. Silence pressed down heavy. No jukebox hum, no clatter of dishes. Just the sound of Murdoch's boots scuffing the linoleum as he struggled to regain balance. He looked around the diner, searching for support, from his crew, from the customers, from anyone. But no one met his eyes. Carla stood tall behind the counter now, her fear melted away, replaced with something close to defiance. Phil, the trucker, leaned back on his stool, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. The young mother who had been shielding her child now sat straighter, her boy peeking curiously over her shoulder with wide, unafraid eyes. The room had shifted. Murdoch wasn't the predator anymore. He was prey, cornered and exposed. Daniel remained in the center of it all, steady and unmoving, his soldiers flanking the door like statues of authority. He didn't need to posture. His silence was louder than Murdoch's shouting ever was. Murdoch's pride wouldn't let him stop. He spat on the floor again, trying to summon the swagger that had slipped from him. You think you've won something here? His voice cracked with desperation. You think these people respect you? They're just scared of you. Earl finally looked up from his plate. His fork rested neatly on the edge, his coffee half empty. He met Murdoch's eyes with the same steady calm he'd carried since the slap. No, Travis. They're not scared of him. They trust him. That's something you'll never understand. The words hit harder than Daniel's grip ever had. Murdoch's face flushed deep red, his jaw working furiously as if searching for a comeback. None came. Phil chuckled, low and sharp. Man's right. Whole town's been tired of your nonsense for months. Guess it took the army to shut you up. A ripple of agreement moved through the diner. Carla nodded, her lips curling into the smallest smile. Even the young mother, her voice soft but firm, added, "You should be ashamed." Murdoch's eyes darted from face to face, desperate, furious, humiliated. These were the same people who had once cowered when he strutted in with his biker crew. Now, they looked at him with something worse than fear. Contempt. He slammed his fist against the table, but it only rattled the cutlery weakly. "You all think you're better than me?" he shouted. Daniel took one deliberate step forward, his boots heavy on the floor. His voice was calm, but it cut like a blade. "No one here had to prove they were better than you, Murdoch. You did that yourself." The biker's chest heaved, his breath shallow. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His pride was bleeding out in front of everyone. Earl leaned back in his booth, folding his arms. "You wanted to humiliate an old man, Travis," he said, voice calm, even. "But in the end, you humiliated yourself." The diner erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement. Heads nodded. Eyes sharpened. For the first time, Murdoch was stripped bare, not by fists, but by truth. His crew by the door shifted uncomfortably, no longer the tough backup he counted on. One of them muttered, "Come on, man. Let's go." But Murdoch stood frozen, caught between the desperate need to save face and the crushing realization that his reign of intimidation was over. Daniel didn't raise his fists again. He didn't need to. His silence, his stillness, his unwavering stance did more damage than any punch could. Finally, Murdoch shoved past the booth, shoulder-checking the wall more than anyone else, and stormed toward the door. His boots pounded the floor, but his steps didn't sound heavy anymore. They sounded hollow. The soldiers at the door didn't move, didn't speak. They simply watched as he pushed past them, a broken king leaving his crumbled throne. The engines outside still growled, waiting. Murdoch climbed onto his bike with shaking hands. The machine roared to life, but the sound no longer inspired fear. It was just noise, loud, empty, meaningless. Inside the diner, Earl lifted his mug and took the last sip of his coffee. 22 minutes, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. And with that, the old man who had been slapped in public sat taller than the bully who had once ruled the room. Travis Murdoch had lost more than a fight that morning. He had lost his audience, his power, his mask. And in its place stood a humiliated man who finally saw himself the way the town always had. The roar of Murdoch's motorcycle faded into the distance, swallowed by the open road. For a long moment, the diner remained still, as if everyone needed proof that the storm had truly passed. The faint hum of the convoy engines outside was the only reminder of how close the room had come to chaos. Earl set his coffee mug down for the last time. His hand, steady as ever, tapped the rim once before he leaned back in the booth. He looked across the table at his son. Daniel stood tall, his broad frame filling the space, but now his posture softened. He exhaled slowly, the tension of command melting away, leaving just a son checking on his father. "You sure you're all right, Dad?" Earl's lips curled into a small, wry smile. "Takes more than a punk like that to shake me." Daniel chuckled, though the tightness in his jaw remained. He had seen war zones, firefights, and chaos most men couldn't imagine, but the sight of his father being struck had lit a fire in him he couldn't easily put out. Carla finally broke the silence. She set the coffee pot down with a loud clink and crossed her arms, staring at Earl. "You should have told us sooner that Daniel was coming. We wouldn't have worried half as much." Earl shrugged, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Didn't need to. I knew he'd show up." The confidence in his tone made Carla shake her head, a half-smile betraying her admiration. Phil slapped the counter with a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd see Travis Murdoch walk out of here with his tail tucked between his legs. That was worth the price of breakfast." A ripple of laughter moved through the diner, nervous at first, then freer, louder, carrying the release of tension everyone had been holding back. The young mother leaned down to whisper to her son, "See? Good always wins." The boy's eyes sparkled as he stared at Daniel like he was a superhero come to life. The soldiers by the door shifted, relaxing now that the confrontation was over. They shared quiet nods with the townsfolk, subtle gestures, but full of reassurance. Their presence alone had been enough to tilt the scales, but it was Daniel's restraint and Earl's quiet dignity that had truly broken Murdoch. Daniel finally slid into the booth across from his father. For a few seconds, they sat in silence, the chaos outside replaced by the comfort of routine. Earl picked up his fork again and stabbed the last piece of bacon on his plate. "You always did have a sense of timing," Earl said between bites. Daniel smirked. "You always did have a way of getting into trouble." Their laughter blended, warm and familiar, cutting through the heavy air like sunlight through clouds. For the first time since the slap, the diner felt alive again. Carla poured Daniel a fresh cup of coffee without asking, her hand steady now. "On the house," she said. "For both of you. After what we just saw, it's the least we can do." Daniel accepted it with a nod, but Earl raised his hand. "No charity. You keep running this place the way you always do, Carla. That's enough." Carla shook her head, but her eyes glistened with respect. Outside, the soldiers began filing back toward the convoy, their boots crunching on gravel in unison. They didn't linger, didn't need to. The message had already been delivered loud and clear. Earl Briggs was not a man to be disrespected, not while his son and his brothers-in-arms walked this earth. Phil raised his mug high like a toast. To Earl. To Daniel. And to putting bullies in their place. The diner echoed with cheers and clinking cups. Earl lifted his own mug but stayed quiet, letting the others celebrate for him. His eyes drifted toward the window, watching the last of the dust settle where Murdoch had ridden off. "Respect," he said softly, almost to himself. "That's all it ever was about." Daniel heard him and nodded. "And you've had it all along, Dad. Today just reminded everyone else." The two men sat together in the booth, one an old soldier, the other still in uniform, both carrying the same iron in their blood. Around them, the diner hummed back to life. Orders were called out, plates clattered, conversations sparked again. But something had changed. The people in that room would never forget what they'd seen. An old veteran standing tall without raising a fist. A bully stripped of his pride. And a son walking in like the embodiment of justice. It wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a place where a lesson had been taught, one that would ripple through the town for years to come. And Earl Briggs, quiet as ever, just picked up his coffee, took one last sip, and smiled.